Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Lancaster Community Library. I'm Alice Cooper, the director, and so glad to have you all here, and we're just thrilled that we're able to sponsor this program along with the Lancaster, Virginia Historical Society. I would like to thank also some of our funders, and thanks to them, they've made this possible. The River Counties Community Foundation, the Wiley Foundation, and River Counties. Oh, and the Grace Episcopal Church yard sale. So yes, thanks to those three, we have a super fantastic summer filled with activities and programs for all ages. Karen here is going to introduce our speaker. Right before she comes up here, I would like to mention a couple of our upcoming programs for grown-ups. So next week on the 22nd, you can celebrate with us 93 years of Nancy Drew. And that's for all ages, So yes, come on. And then on the 27th, a lot of you may know Alfie Butts. He is an attorney in Irvington who is, his specialty is estate law, and he will be giving a program on estate planning. So, thank you all for being here, and Karen?
Well, thanks for coming, and we're really glad to partner with the Lancaster Community Library for some of these summer programs. A couple others that we are co-sponsoring will be in July. One is the Author Expo. So we'll have authors of all genres, but if you like history and historical fiction, we'll definitely have plenty of that at our table, and some other local and regional authors. And we will, Jim, we'll have your books at our table again, even though you won't be with us that day. And then later in July, we have Pixie E. Curry, who is doing oral history interviews of interesting people with heritage in the Northern Neck, but also some of the movers and shakers of today in the Northern Neck. And she'll be talking about how she came into this project as a native of Kilmarnock. I want to thank you all for your cooperation with reservations tonight. This library, the meeting rooms are so popular that between all the scheduling, we had to use this room tonight. The other programs that you see on the adult programming list will be in a larger space upstairs, so you don't need reservations, but you might want to come early for the best seats. Tonight we have Jim Bish with us. Jim grew to adulthood on a cattle and horse ranch in Nebraska, where at an early age he was fascinated with stories from his grandmother about his ancestors who homesteaded the area in the 1870s. His genealogy and history pursuits identified ancestors who earlier lived in 9 of the 13 colonies, with at least 15 who served in the Revolutionary War. And then he found out that his direct ancestor, Colonel John West, served alongside George Washington in Fairfax County as the representatives to the House of Burgesses from 1761 to 1775. So you're going to find out more about why those neighbors and friend associations are so important. His historical quest led to a career in education and history, and after graduate school, Jim traveled east here to Virginia and has spent almost 40 years researching and teaching local, regional, and Virginia state history, encountering and examining many of the colonial Virginia families, which became the foundation for tonight's talk and the book. In 1989, Jim helped to organize the Prince William County Historical Society, where he served as the organization's first president, and he continues to serve on the board of directors. He has also worked at the National Museum of the Marine Corps and later served with Prince William County government as a member of the Prince William County Historical Commission. He runs his own tour company, History Happened Here, and also volunteers with the National Museum of Americans in Wartime and the Museum of Culpeper County, where he serves on the board. So very busy and very involved in local history. We're happy to have him here tonight. He will be around afterwards. We'll have questions at the end. I just want to put in a plug for the Historical Society and our library. Hopefully many of the things he talks about tonight are footnotes that are in the book. Those are the kinds of things you would find in our research library. And we are working toward doubling the space that we have, and we're in a capital campaign, so there's some brochures out there about that, and we are getting very close to being able to start renovations and construction on that. So I'm going to turn things over to Jim, and we'll keep him in the frame because we are videoing this tonight. It's going out on Facebook Live now, and then it'll be recorded, so if you want to watch it again, give it a few days, and then it'll be on the library's YouTube channel.
Thank you, Karen. Well, welcome. Thanks for that nice remarks. And today we're going to talk about something local that you're all probably familiar with. Just a plug about the Historical Society. I was coming here to the Historical Society when Carolyn Jett, I'm sure many of you ran into her over the years because she did so much work here. And she was my first introduction to looking through some of the resources that that were local.
Just a tiny bit that way. For the camera. Had to check the screen.
Now, so I, as Karen mentioned, most of my career was teaching high school. I taught in Prince William County. I taught the same high school for over 30 years. And in doing so, I started a course which was local history, local Virginia history. The regular course is U.S. and Virginia history. You always had to teach those. But I wanted to dig a little deeper, and there was so much fascinating history in Virginia. And to get to it, you really have to go locally. So that's where I really started developing an interest of the Northern Neck down here. Up in the northern part, of course, the Northern Neck that I know of really is between the Rappahannock and Potomac River all the way to West Virginia. But in more modern times, this refers to the Northern Neck from east of Fredericksburg, more so. But we were in the northern part of the Northern Neck, and whenever you did anything, for example, the Carter family owned half of Prince William County. And so whenever I started doing local research there, it always brought me back to this area, either Westmoreland or Richmond or Lancaster or the Northern Neck counties down here that we think of. Because those founding fathers, those early Cavaliers that settled here, they did a lot of patenting up the rivers. And the later generations, by the 1760s, 70s, 80s, their descendants, many of them were up the river doing things. Like George Washington. You know, his grandfather, John Washington, patented where Mount Vernon was. So that's where I kept running into here. To me, to understand history, you can't just look at the look, you have to figure out where the families come from, how they got up there. So all of my research really brought me back to this area to understand things. And that's where doing genealogy helps out a lot, those types of skills. But anyway, one of the things that I was always interested in too were the stories about Washington. You know, when I grew up, for the past 100 years, I'll put it this way. How many of you have heard of the cherry tree story? And I've asked that question for 10 years, and I'm going around, and everybody's heard of that. How many of you believe that it's true? And that's pretty much the normal response that I get. But when I was in Prince William County, doing research, and it was nice because I was doing research for a class I taught, so I had a real reason to do research. I ran into the author that wrote that story. His name was Parson Weems. He actually lived in Dumfries, Virginia, in Prince William County, when he wrote the story. And he is buried in Prince William County. That's pretty much from 1795 until his death 30 years later, is where he operated out of. And looking back at newspaper accounts of his life while he was living, he was a very well-respected person. He was a minister. He gave up the ministry to write and sell books. He wasn't someone that's going to make up a lot of lies. That just didn't make sense to me, that he could be making up lies. So I began to research, and the more I researched, I realized that if you follow the Ball family back, it's going to lead you to where all those sources were. And in Weems's own book, he footnotes and tells most of the sources. There's only a few sources that he doesn't identify, and the reason for most of those are that were deceased sources that he interviewed or talked to years earlier, but they weren't living at the time that he was writing the book. So we'll start out here, and the first thing that I looked at was was, what did Weems say? What hints did he give to tell us where he got the book? Or, and who was it that first really started condemning what Weems wrote? And what I found out was, nobody really condemned Weems to a significant importance until the 1880s. Weems dies in 1825. He writes most of his works between 1800 and 1815 or 20. So 60 years after his death, historians start condemning what he wrote. And Alice, you'll enjoy this, because Henry Cabot Lodge is a New Englander. He was in the United States Senate, powerful senator. Before that, he graduated with a history degree from Harvard. And he's the one that started the track. He said that Weems' book would never be found in the hands of the polite society of the great eastern towns. It was tawdry style, only appealed to a backwoodsman, no English-speaking people, certainly no Virginians ever thought of behavior talked in 1740 like the personages in Weems' stories. I don't think a New Englander understands how Virginians talk. But anyway, he's the first significant person as a senator and a historian to really condemn Weems. And once he got the ball rolling, they added on. Woodrow Wilson, before he became president, called the cherry tree story a fallacy. Paul Ford, in 1896, called Weems a fabricator and sensation monger. William Roscoe Thayer was the head of the American Historical Association, and he really started condemning Weems and making it up. He said, "Why couldn't George Washington lie?" Was the comment little boy knew. Couldn't he talk? You know, I mean, he starts it, and these are, especially Thayer, and these people are prominent historians that people believe in. And then you have Rupert Hughes, which was Randolph Hughes' brother, in 1927, in his work, George Washington, the Rebel and the Patriot, called Weems a slush of plagiarism and piety. And so, and whenever I would read, and you can look at every George Washington documentary almost, they always bring up the cherry tree. I get it so much in my news feeds, you know. Cherry tree story was made up. If you go to Mount Vernon or go to any of the historical sites, they'll tell you the same thing. It was made up by Parson Weems. And I always couldn't figure out, where did all these people think they got it made up at? There's no information that even leads to that this was a made up story. You know, historians are the one that started saying it was made up, and then after 120 years or 140 years of saying it's a made up story, like this room, everybody believes that it's a made up story because they feel embarrassed to say, no, I don't think it was a made up story. Well, I was in conflict because I was identifying how important and popular Weems was as a person in the 1815 era, 1820. Different newspaper mentions of him. He always was with the most important people of the community. And then these people call him a liar. So to me, something just didn't jive. So I started following the Ball family. First thing I did was look at what Weems wrote. He said, the following anecdote is a case in point. It is too valuably lost and too true to be doubted, for it was communicated to me by the same excellent lady to whom I am indebted for the last. In introducing the previous, now there were two anecdotes in here he contributes to this same person. One of the anecdotes was about how if you wait in the fall, fruit will give you all the food you need, and you have to be patient, but God will provide for yourself with a lot of abundance of fruit in the fall. And the other one was, of course, the cherry tree story. There were two separate incidents happened, and when he writes about, and then he said, we stated, quote, some idea of Washington's plan of education in this respect may be collected from the following anecdote. Related to me 20 years ago by an aged lady who was a distant relative, and one of the girls spent much of her time in the family. On a fine morning, she said, in the fall of 1737, so he even gives a date, Mr. Washington, having little George by the hand, came to the door and asked my cousin Washington and myself to walk with him to the orchard. And then some things that he indicates there is Weems hints indicating sources for the orchard anecdote. He says related to him 20 years ago by an aged lady. And so 20 years ago would be about 1786, because he wrote this in 1806. And the distant relative most likely related through the Ball side of the family, as Weems was married into the Ball family. And so those are hints that I started looking at to try to identify, and then I just had to figure out, going back to what connections did Weems have with the Ball family, and what connections did the Ball family have with George Washington when he was little, those Ball family members. So that was basically my first quest.
I know it's a wide angle, so we just need you, well, just stay closer.
Okay, next.
I know, we're gonna be like, I'm gonna stand here so you can't get past me.
Okay, so,
Yeah,
I just feel like I'm so close to the screen.
yeah, it's just the angle.
But, so, just to kind of give you a little bit of a genealogy, here's Mason Weems. He's married to Fanny Ewell, and of course, the Ewells all came from here, this branch. Fanny Ewell was married to Mason Weems. Her father was Jesse Ewell, who's married to Charlotte Ewell. Believe me, there's a lot of northern neck first cousin marriages. I mean, I would find them all the time. And Fanny's grandmother was Sarah Ball, who married Charles Ewell. Sarah Ball was from Bewdley, and Charles Ewell grew up at Belle Isle, and they were right across Deep Creek from each other growing up. And so those connections, then I started going on and knew that there was connections. As I said, Jesse was Parson Mason Weems' father-in-law, and his mother-in-law was Charlotte Ewell. It's a first cousin marriage. Both Jesse and Charlotte's parents were from the Lancaster. And there are their children. Of course, they had 18 children. One female. Sometimes you'll see 18 children, there'll be 2 or 3 different wives. But Charlotte gave birth to 18 children. This is Fanny right here. She was born in 1775, married Mason Locke Weems. So that's their kids. This is Bel Air. If you ever get to Prince William County, this is the oldest home in Prince William County. It was built about 1740, and it was built by Charles Ewell. Charles Ewell expanded Belle Isle here. His father was a builder, his grandfather was a builder, and that house has never been, but it's always been independently owned, and still is today, as the owners of it have taken really good care of it. Charles and Sarah Ball Ewell were Fanny Ewell's grandparents, and they were the first ones to come up the river. They were both born here in Lancaster, and after marriage, they migrated up to Prince William County. And I found a lot of connections through them to George Washington, and I'll explain that in a second. But Charles Ewell's daughter, they had 5 or 6 kids that survived, but the 2 that are most important to the connections are Mary Amney Ewell. She was the daughter of Sarah Ball and Charles Ewell. She will end up marrying Dr. James Craig. Now, why he's important is Dr. James Craig was George Washington's closest friend. So, if this isn't just enough of a connection, Mason Weems' wife, her aunt, was Dr. James Craig's wife. So she was the niece of Dr. James Craig and Mary Amney Ewell Craig. They were with Washington all of his life. Dr. Craig was a friend of Washington in the French and Indian War. They befriended. Washington evidently introduced him to his cousin Mary Amney. They got married at Bel Air. From there, they went to Port Tobacco in Maryland. That's where their home was for the next 20-some years. The first person that Washington called in the Revolutionary War to head up the medical department was his good friend, Dr. Craig. They always were together. They went on Western trips together. And they were related through the Ball family and the wife. So they were very strongly connected. He was their family physician. He was at Washington's deathbed, the first doctor called on George Washington's deathbed in December of 1799. So very close net from 1750s to 1799. These were 2 close friends. And they were the uncle of Parson Weems' aunt, or wife. So it's close connection here. Here tells you just a little bit more. I'll bypass some of that, but this is Dr. Craig's timeline. Began service with George Washington 1754. Dr. Craig administered the wounds to Braddock in 1754 during the French and Indian War, administered the wounds to Lafayette after Brandywine. He was with Washington. He was in second command of the medical department of the Continental Army. And the reason why he wasn't the first in command, because his first command, he was going to be away from George Washington. This way he could always be next to Washington throughout the war, and he was. He was with Washington all the way through, close. And as part of that, his wife was often with them, as was Martha. Whenever they were in winter camps, she was usually there, as was Mary Ann Neal Craig. So they were close. Now, getting me back here, there are some Ball family members that headed north that are important to this story, that they all come from here. And of course, James Ball, I took a little trip today out to St. Mary's Whitechapel Church, and that's where James Ball is buried. James Ball here, he married 3 times. His second wife, Mary Conway, is buried right next to him. And his third wife, which was Mary Ann Bertrand, she married Charles Yule, and after he passed away, she married William Valentine. After he passed away, she finally married a third time, James Ball. So, and they're buried together. And there's very nice things said about both of his wives that were named Mary. So those connections. Now, Sarah Ball, right here, who's married to Charles Yule, and then later after his death, she marries Benjamin Grayson. She ends up at Bel Air in Prince William. Jedethan Ball doesn't live very long. He dies down here, but his son, who is Burgess Ball, ends up in up in Loudoun County and in Fredericksburg area initially. And then Sina Ball, she ends up in present-day Fairfax County. So these are 3 Ball members that go up the river. And the rest of these Ball members generally stay down here in the Northern Neck. And that's common. Of the Northern Neck families that you see go up the river in the next 50 or 100 years, usually about a third of them end up somewhere north, a third end up here, and a third end up somewhere else. But that's pretty common. Some of the homes that were important, Butely there, James Ball's home. You have Whitechapel Church. You have Belle Isle here, the newer Belle Isle. The original Belle Isle that Charles Yule lived in probably was ended by the 1750s or 1760 when the new Belle Isle was built in a little bit of a different location. And of course, this is a new version of Moratico, probably made of some of the existing, which was Joseph Ball's second home. And then of course, you've got Joseph Ball's Forest Quarter or Epping Forest, different versions of the name. And these are the locations, of course. You've got the Balls all through up in here, different other ones that are involved in the story because they all end up different, marrying different, like Travers, the Foxes, the Valentines, Chins, Travers, they're all intermarried into the Ball family. Descendants of Lancaster, from my research, there are 3 of Joseph Ball's children that end up in the north. Hannah Ball ends up marrying Raleigh Travers, and they end up in Potomac Creek, just north of Fredericksburg. And he passes away, then she marries a second time to Simon Pearson. Almost all of their kids, Simon Pearson's patent, tens of thousands of acres in Fairfax County, Arlington. So their Ball cousins are all up there with George. And I did some research, which is in the book, with Alexandria. About 80% of the initial lots purchased in Alexandria are Ball family members that are connected to George Washington through Hannah's descendants, through Hannah Ball's descendants. And then of course Joseph Ball Jr. He was over in England most of the time, but his descendants come here, and there's a number of descendants that are buried in Culpeper County where I am from that group. But those are the 3. Then of course Mary Ball. So Hannah Ball, Joseph Ball, and Mary Ball are the 3 that are heading north. And it shows up in correspondence. These are correspondence, 3 different letters from Joseph Ball to Mary Ball, Washington, while he's over in England. And he's asking about his brothers and sisters. And she's talking to him about Mr. Daniel and cousin Hannah and different things to her half-brother. So these are a half-brother and half-sister. But he's asking her about information about them. And the only one she really gives information is about Hannah. So that tells me that she was in pretty connected contact with Hannah Ball Pearson at the time. So she was giving her half-brother Joseph over in England information about the family. And he was asking as well. So Joseph Jr., Hannah, her half-sister Hannah, and her, they communicated more than, but there was only like Esther Ball. I've never seen any communication between them and Mary Ball. And there's a lot of stories about her, but she's the one that had a difficult marriage, and but anyway, there's connections that prove these connections were there, and they were keeping track. And then a little bit about Mary Ball's life. Of course, Mary Ball grew up down in this area, her early years. Some historians think that she moved pretty quickly over to where her mother's second marriage to Richard Hughes. Now this, at the top, you've got Mary Bennett. She first married, I say Bennett. My research leans towards Bennett as her real maiden name. And not proven, but a lot of things point that way more than any other direction. Her first husband, William Johnson, when she married Joseph Ball, she was known as Johnson, Widow Johnson. She marries Joseph Ball as her second husband. He dies fairly shortly after their marriage, probably within 4 years. And then she marries Richard Hughes later. Richard Hughes is on the Potomac side of the Northern Neck. And a lot of people think that she moved right over there, but in part of the way the will stated, she had life interest in the Ball property here, and her half-brother Joseph was kind of a little upset with her, wanted her to kind of get off the property a few years after her husband had passed away, and which tells me that she was utilizing that Ball connection and utilizing her property here that she had a life interest in. So that tells me that probably Mary was up here with a lot of her Ball cousins growing up, at least till she was 10 or so. Where a lot of people think she was here for 2 or 3 years and then gone, but I think she was probably here and connected to her Ball family more than what some people believe, and that she continued to be very close to her Ball cousins here in Lancaster. To the point, and a lot of people, and I'm not saying that this isn't true, Mary Ball had a rough childhood. But believe me, when you study Northern Neck colonial life, everybody had a rough childhood. I mean, it seems like half the family members' children growing up are dying before they're 10 or 12. A lot of death, a lot of blended families. There's a lot of women dying. There's a lot of men dying. Just on the Charles Yule side, you've got what I talked about, James Yule, or James Ball. He married 3 different women, and his third wife was Mary Bertrand Yule Valentine Ball. That was her third husband. And you see that a lot when you study colonial Lancaster and colonial Northern Neck families. There's a lot of blended half-brothers, half-sisters in that mix-up. And now, one thing I think that Mary Ball could have been really proud of, that there doesn't really come out in the general history. I see so much Washington stuff. Washington this and Washington that. Washingtons weren't as politically involved as the Ball family. Just to show you, Mary Ball's father was served in the House of Burgesses to 1702. Her uncle William Ball II was served before she was born. But during her growing up years, here's Mary Ball over here. Her first cousin William Ball served in the House of Burgesses from 1702 to 1723, 20 years. Her her uncle James Ball, who's right here at Bewdley, he serves from 1715 to 1740. She was born around 1708. So think about that. These are all Ball family members that are in the highest body, not only in Virginia, but probably in all the colonies. And then she has another uncle, George Ball, who's serving in the House of Burgesses 1723. So she's got, her father served in the House, 3 of her uncles are serving in the House while she's growing up. So having a Ball name meant something in the Northern Neck. And not only that, but she was very well connected to other Northern Neck people that were in the House of Burgesses. Edwin Conway was married to her half-sister Anne. He was a long-term Burgess from Lancaster County. Charles Burgess was here at Deep Creek. He was a short-term, but he was very influential until he dies. He's in the House of Burgesses from 1728 to 1734, about the time that she's marrying. But she would have known him because the Burgesses and the Balls. I'll put it this way. Her, James Ball was the administrator for Charles Burgess's estate. And Charles Burgess had as one of his indentureships, he had Charles Yules as an indentured, but was learning the trade, the merchant business with him. And of course, he died halfway through the indenture. It wasn't an indentureship, it was an apprenticeship. And Charles Burgess, after that, in his will, he said, should I die, James Ball should take over the apprenticeship. So Charles Yule, who married Sarah Ball and moved up to Bel Air, he was first apprentice under Charles Burgess, then he was apprentice under James Ball, who later became his father-in-law, and then later became his stepfather. His Yule's mother ended up marrying him later. So they were very connected, and they literally, if you go over to Deep Creek and where they are, you can see where the homes were just across Deep Creek together. So, and these are all Ball members that served well after her children were growing up, Mary Ball Washington. So the Ball family is much more respected than what people kind of talk about it politically. They were pretty connected. And the Northern Neck was even much more connected. George Eskridge, there's a lot of connection with there, both with the Washingtons and the Balls. And I'm pretty sure that if you look at some of the committee makeups, James Ball is on the same of some of the same committees as Edwin Conway and Eskridge in the House of Burgesses. So there was kind of like a voting block in the Northern Neck. So those people were always communicating. So I'm sure she was pretty well in tune, much more than people talk about. You know, just to get back to the Washington side, there's a few people that have tried to figure out who was that Weems was talking about, and they always look at Washington descendants. Nobody ever looks at a Ball descendant. It's like, wasn't George Washington related to the Ball family too? You know, it's like they just get left out of things. It's always the Washington. It's never the Ball side. And to me, the Ball side was the important one because Mary Ball's husband dies in 1743. George is 11. She never remarries. I don't know about you, but common sense tells me that she's probably going to be more dependent on her Ball family connections than her Washington family connections because she's a Ball. I mean, to me, that just makes sense. So why don't we follow the Ball side to see who was connected, which I tried to do. But anyway, there's a lot of Balls at that time period that were very heavily involved in the politics locally. Now, then I had to figure out how close was Mary's father to James Ball. And what I found was everybody thought they were the closest Ball cousins that existed. It really starts with George Washington Ball in the mid-1800s. He started mentioning about how close these two families were. They were both vestry members in the church at Whitechapel. They lived close by each other, and they were closely connected. And then from him saying that, in 1903, Mrs. Roger Pryor, in her book, Mother Washington in Her Time, she said, the proud young mother hastens to present her fine boy to her kindred. And when he was a month old, she took him to visit her cousin, Major James Ball, at Bewdley. And then another instance in 1930, in the book The Mother of Washington, Nancy Turner wrote, before George was a month old, she bundled him up, too full of pride to wait another day, and drove away to show him to her favorite cousins, the James Balls. And then the other one in Turing Historyland, because there were no small children in Epping Forest, Mary Ball, as a child, formed a warm attachment for the children at Buteley. It was to Buteley she took her firstborn, the future first president of the United States. Now, to me, that all makes sense, because Mary Ball was almost a generation younger than her half-siblings. They were much older. And James Ball and Mary Ball's older half-siblings, they were kind of in the same age group. They were first cousins. Mary Ball's the first cousin to James Ball as well, but there's about 25 years different time frame. So James Ball's having kids her age, and they're attending the same church. They're both Balls, and so it makes sense that she would have a warm attachment to that group, of that family. That includes Sarah Ball, that family that's at Buteley. They were the same age as her. Then this is where I get another connection. The book talks a lot about that, about the iron connection. After Mary Ball marries Augustine Washington, he's involved in the iron business, and of course that takes him down to Accokeek, and it takes him down to the Potomac Creek area, north in Stafford County, north of Fredericksburg. And they initially go up they leave Pope's Creek, they go up for about 3 years to Little Hunting Creek, which is present-day Mount Vernon, and then they come back down to Fredericksburg in the fall of 1738. But he's involved heavily, and it's the iron business that's really given him a lot of money. He's on a monthly salary income, sends his 2 older boys to England, buys a lot of land, Augustine does. And everything's going pretty good. Well, Augustine's partner is Nathaniel Chapman. He's from Maryland. He comes down here to kind of manage the Accokeek iron furnace. And so they turn into very close partnership. And lo and behold, Hannah's daughter, Constantia Pearson, ends up marrying Nathaniel Chapman. So Augustine Washington, Mary Ball, his close partner marries Hannah Ball's daughter. So you have a Ball connection there in the iron business. And then before long, after the apprenticeship to James Ball ends here at Buteley for Charles Yule, he ends up getting into the iron business as well. He's first into the iron business at Bristol Iron Works. He's working with the Taylor family. And then he partners up with Nathaniel Chapman. They're in partnership together for a while. And then they move north, and Yule moves up to Prince William to open up some iron works up there. And so what you have, these 3 Ball husbands, Nathaniel Chapman, who's married to Hannah Ball's daughter, Constantia Pearson, Mary Ball, who's married to Augustine Washington, and Charles Yule, who's married to Sarah Ball, they're all in the iron business together. And look at their children's ages. They're all partnering in the iron business, and their children, 1733 to 1749 for Constantia and Nathaniel Chapman, Mary and Augustine, 1732 to 1739, and Charles Yule and Sarah Ball Yule, 1737, 17. So their kids are growing up at the same time, and they're in partnership. So I've met almost everybody, they know all the stories that are going on. So anybody that is close to these people by the late 18th century, they probably know all the stories from all the childhood that's going on, because they were in the family a lot. The Ball family, Parson Weems' wife, and again, I pretty much showed you this, but one family member that keeps popping up north is Sinah. There's Sarah Ball, and she marries Charles Yule. They're up north. Sinah Ball ends up marrying Daniel McCarty. Daniel McCarty is the daughter of Sarah McCarty, Sarah Ball McCarty. And I'll tell more about them later, but there's also Burgess Ball here. So you've got Sinah, Burgess, and Sarah Ball. There was that. Now, who was Reverend Mason Weems? He was not just the bumbling itinerant poor bookseller that most historians portrayed him from. Mason Weems comes from a very wealthy family, and in the Northern Neck, you can probably appreciate the name Weems. Most other places in Virginia wouldn't recognize that name, but here you would, and it's because they come from the same family. There were 3 brothers that came over from Scotland. They came over very wealthy. Their mother and father had a castle. They were in prominent nobility in Scotland. The father dies, ends up having that the oldest child of the fathers ended up taking over the castle and the business. So the 3 kids and the wife end up coming over here with their uncle, who is William Locke, Dr. William Locke. He was pretty wealthy himself. 2 of the boys, there's James Weems, and there's David Weems, and then the sister ends up marrying a Moore up in the Philadelphia area. All very wealthy. Billingsley House, which is in Upper Marlborough, that still survives, is the Weems family home. David Weems' home doesn't survive, but he had 19 children, 3 different wives. 12 survived. Mason Weems was the youngest one, but he was very wealthy too. He had a fleet of merchant ships. In fact, during the Revolutionary War, he was about 80 years old, and those merchant ships were working for the Continental Army. So he ends up, and his son David Weems, who is the lower guy here, right under Mason Weems, they're brothers. He takes over the merchant business, and it's his descendants that have the whole steamboat merchant business that goes through the Northern Neck. That merchant business of the Weems family was going on from the 1740s all the way into the 20th century. Same family, all descendants of David Weems, who was the Mason Weems' father and his brother. So, very wealthy family. One major important connection is that Parson Weems is sent from around Annapolis, where he grew up. He ends up in Charles County to school. He went to a plantation school that just happened to be at the Jennifers. Now, the Jennifer family was very wealthy in Charles County. Daniel Jennifer ended up signing the United States Constitution. So he ended up in a good spot. It also happened to be where Dr. James Craik was located. So the Craik children and Weems ended up going to the same plantation school. And here's a couple of little nuggets that I found that connects that. George Washington in 1787 said, the Reverend Mr. Weems and young Dr. Craik came here yesterday in the afternoon, left this noon about noon for Port Tobacco. Well, historians like that, they just don't understand how there's a connection there, how Weems ended up getting connected to Craik. Well, in Bishop Meade's work on the churches of Virginia, he states this in the book. In his youth, Mr. Weems was an inmate of the family of Mr. Jennifer of Charles County. They confided in him as a boy principal and had no doubt as to his uprightness and morality. When he was the age of 15, he would leave the house every evening to visit a nearby hut, where, surrounded by the bareheaded, barefooted, and half-clad children of the neighborhood, whom he had been inhabited gathering around him at night in order to give him instruction. He was teaching kids that didn't have an opportunity to teach while he was learning at the plantation school in Charles County. So those are little nuggets, and these are the important people that are around. A is where Dr. Craik's house was. B is where the school was. But these are, Dr. Gustavus Brown was called to Mount Vernon on George Washington's death night. Craik was there as well. Jennifer married Dr. Craik's daughter. Thomas Stone was the signer of the Declaration of Independence. So this was a very wealthy area. If you go to Port Tobacco today, you hardly see anything. It's virtually vanished. There's a couple of historic sites there, but in the 1740s, it was one of the hustling, bustling communities in Virginia. Now, Sinaball. In Maryland. Sinaball. Everything kept coming to her with the hints that Weems gave us. The source of many of George Washington's childhood anecdotes was certainly Sinaball. In the fall of 1737 to the spring of 1738, she would have been 9 years old, turning 10. Now remember, Weems says that this girl that's a cousin was, and by you do the math, she was a little older than George, but she was a girl yet, he was a boy, and she said little George by the hand, but Augusta took them both out to the orchard. And Sandoval would have been 9, turning 10 in February. George would have been 5, turning 6 in February. Sandoval's first cousin was Sarah Ball McCarty. This is an image of Sarah Ball McCarty. I do not have an image of Sina, but we do have one of Sarah Ball. She married Dennis McCarty, who first moved from here up to Fairfax County in the 1720s. They lived at Cedar Grove for a while, and then they built a newer, nicer home, which is this one that they called Mount Ayr. And this home here ended up being taken by, well, inherited by her son, by Sarah's son, who ended up marrying Sina Ball, who was Bewdley, James Bewdley's daughter. Now, at Bewdley. So you've got, and where all this fits is Sina Ball's mother, Mary Conway, died in 1730. He does not, James Ball does not marry Mary Bertrand Ewell Valentine until 1742. So there's 12 years that he's raising 7 children under the age of 14 alone. And I don't know, but common sense tells me that I'm sure that he probably farmed those children out to some of his cousins, different periods of the year, especially during harvest time. Yeah. And all of a sudden, things start making sense. She remained single, and just that this is Bewdley again. This is Mount Vernon. This is Hunting Creek at the time. It wasn't Mount Vernon yet. It's been added significantly onto. This is Bel Air, and I'm sure she spent some time at Bel Air because her sister and brother-in-law Charles Ewell were up there as well. And this is Mount Ayr. The hints, Wings hints indicating that fruit orchard anecdote. 20 years ago when Wings Cherry Anecdote was published was 1786. That's when Weems ends up with Dr. James Craig Jr. visiting George Washington Mount Vernon. I'm sure before they did that, they went over to see Sina Ball McCarty, because there's all kinds of evidence that whenever the Craigs were in the area, they always visited the McCartys, and it makes sense. It was their aunt. And these come from George Washington's own notes in his diaries, where they're visiting him, and then they're going over the McCartys, all of that. So I am pretty positive that before they visited Mount Vernon that day, they stayed overnight with Sarah at Mount Airy. And from there, she told him all the stories from her childhood about George, because he was very into learning stuff about George Washington. And so 20 years by the time he wrote it, that's where he learned a lot of the stories was from Sina. And he mentions that from an aged lady, well, the average lifespan in the 1780s was in the high 40s. She was 59 at the time, so she would have been an aged lady. She didn't call her old, but she was an aged lady. Who was a distant relative. George and Sina Ball were second cousins to Sina's father. James Ball and Mary Ball Washington were first cousins. So all those things seem to fit. If you look at the deed records, Ferry Farm, Washington didn't really obtain Ferry Farm until October. He bought the property on October 25th, 1738. They didn't move in until November to mid-December of 1738. So George Washington would have been almost 6.5 when they moved to Ferry Farm from Mount Vernon, or back then Little Hunting Creek, which would have been just before, 2 or 3 months before George's 7th birthday. But the source says, when a girl, he said, in Weems's writing, he says in the fall of 1737. Well, in the fall of 1737, George would have been 6, 5 going on 6, and they would have been at Mount Vernon, not at Ferry Farm. And also, she also mentions a little later that just about 6, when she talks about the cherry tree story and the hatchet, when George was just about 6. So I'm pretty certain that Sina Ball was staying at the Washingtons, and then shortly away from the Washington Cedar Grove, just a few miles away, she was probably going between her cousins. They were taking care of her, and she just happened to be there between the fall and early spring of 1737, 1738, because both of those stories, according to Weems, that's when they happened. in that time frame. More hints. Both McCarty and Washington had children close to Simon's age to play, benefiting all the cousins. The Dennis and Sarah Ball McCarty children were Daniel, born 1725, and 1730, and Sarah, born 1731. Meanwhile, in 1737, the Washingtons had George, Betty, Samuel, and John Auguste. So those are the children. Sarah was closest in age to Anne McCarty. Sarah was born in 1728. And ironically, guess who Sarah or Sina ends up marrying? Which adds more validity to that she was up there in the family a lot. She ends up marrying her cousin Daniel, who was born in 1725. So as a girl, she's up there a lot, and she ends up marrying him, and then she ends up taking over Mount Airy. One of George Washington's maps, he writes, he shows the old orchard point on one of the maps of Mount Vernon, with a kind of, and here's where Old Orchard Point is today, and there's Mount Vernon. Burgess Ball, very connected with the family too. Burgess Ball was the first cousin to Fannie Ewell Weems, first cousin once removed. He was the first cousin to both Mary Amney Ewell Craig, and Burgess Ball it was the person that notified George Washington the death of his mother. And of course, he's married to Charles Washington's daughter, but he not only informs Washington of the death of his mother, George's mother, but also the death of his brother Charles. So, and there's a lot of correspondence between Burgess Ball. This is Weems's, Parson Weems's wife's first cousin, once removed. They were close. Now, really, would Mason Weems, would a reverend who's well respected, have lied while married into the Ball family, living among Ball family members? Think about this. Would you lie about your wife's or husband's relatives and writing a book? I don't think many would probably get away with that. It just doesn't make sense to me that he's going to be lying about his in-laws that are pretty important and famous people. And all these people that he's supposed to be lying about and making up stories, none of them ever claimed that he was lying at the time. They accepted the stories as legitimate. The McCarty family, who signed it, was one that told the stories. None of her family members said there were any lies. Burgess Ball's family never said there were any lies. And these people would have all known the Washington stories. Dr. Craig's family, no lies. James Craig is another one. He's the grandson of Dr. Craig. He writes a really nice piece later in his life talking about how important and great person that Weems was, and how they used to visit the Ewell family in Prince William every summer for 3 weeks. George Washington Parke Custis and Eleanor Custis Lewis, who was raised by George Washington, they never said anything about the stories being made up. In fact, George Washington Parke Custis adds another anecdote about lying about Washington and killing his mother's favorite colt in one of his stories. And so you have all these things that it just doesn't make sense that this person is lying. You know, all these historians are saying he's lying. And as I said, there's no criticism of Weems from Washington's closest family members, including Martha. She was alive the first 2 years Weems's books came out. Dr. Craig didn't die until 1814. And then, of course, Washington's two grandchildren that grew up in the household, none of them ever said anything about that those stories weren't true. And to me, they would hold more legitimacy than historians 100 years later. Even, okay, historians often say, well, you know, they have to be made up. Ewell family tried to defend the stories. In the 1930s, Alice Maud Ewell, she wrote that we had, of course, in the little bookcase, Parson Weems' quaint and charming life of Washington. Both my grandparents firmly believed in the Hatchet story, as the present writer still does. That's her right here. And then on his, Weems's actual descendant, Robert Weems, was trying to, articles were coming out how his Weems' ancestor made up all the stories. And he wrote Parson Weems and George Washington to the editor of the Post-Dispatch. In an editorial, you state that Parson Weems made out of whole cloth the story of the cherry tree, which young Washington said he cut down. It so happens we have handed down the generation to generation this cherry tree story, along with many other anecdotes of Washington, who was a parishioner of my great-grandfather's church. We have from generation to generation been told by our forebears that the cherry tree story is true in its entirety. Of course, historians like that say, well, yeah, a family member would say it, make it up and say that. But who would know those stories unless they were family members? You know, they're the only ones that would know the legitimacy of the stories. So, a year or so ago, I found a historian, Richard Gardner. This was an article about a college class where they're teaching historical methods and source out your sources before you write something. Make sure you've got sources. And they were using how Weems made up this thing, and everybody believed the story of the cherry tree, and then you look and there wasn't any sources to it, so they always source things. So they were basically saying that the story was untrue because it wasn't sourced well enough. But historians using that, they said, what sources do you have? Gardner's pointing out, what sources do you have that it's false? You know, if you're going to make it up, that you make sure you source something out, make sure you source it out so you can say that it definitely was a false story. You can't do that. So he basically said, come on, historians, don't embarrass our craft. Go make arguments to provide sources. And I was totally in agreement with him when this article came out. And then just not even a year ago, Los Angeles Times, editorial in the history of the big lie from Plato to TikTok. And he goes back, but then of course, whenever you talk about lying, you got to include Parson Weems in it. The myth we believed for so long about George Washington, the cherry tree, is an example of a platonic grand lie. In early years, the country of the United States felt the need for good founding lies, and Washington, the tall, well-spoken, heroic founding father, seemed the perfect subject. In the 6th edition of Washington's biography in 1806, author Mason Locke Weems described young George chopping down a cherry tree, confessing to the father, I cannot tell a lie, but this parable in lying was itself a lie. It remained popular for generations and ultimately outlived the book. And then he goes on other things. But it's like, to me, the big lie is that historians made up that it's been a lie, and that's hung around for 140 years. That's the real lie. If you look at where the source is, the connection, there's no way Weems is going to be lying about the cherry tree. And my last thing here, to me, the person that's really been hurt in this is Weems. He's been made fun of, he's been called a liar, but some credible literary people have looked at his works and put him on a stage and that he really should be. I look at him, that he was the most read author between 1800 and 1840. 40 years of America, that he was the most read author in American literature. That's longer than almost any other famous author. If you look at that list, Irving, Cooper, Edgar Allan Poe, Emerson, Henry Longfellow, Hawthorne, Melville, Thoreau, Whitman. He should be on that list. He was the first great American literate. Now, some people have mentioned that. Weems' biographer Lawrence Roth writes, for his own generation, he was the most widely read of American authors. In 1996, Benjamin Franklin scholar Carla Mulford stated, although Mason Locke Weems was dead by the time the first quarter of the 19th century concluded, his rendering of Franklin's life produced 10 times through the century and indeed seems to have surpassed Franklin's own life writing in popularity. Biographical historian Edward O'Neill called Weems the first important figure in 19th century biography and one of the most remarkable and influential figures in American letters. And to me, he's the one that's been really damaged by this. George Washington hasn't been damaged. I mean, a 5-year-old, give a boy a 5-year-old hatchet, what's he gonna do? I ended up giving a 7-year-old a stick about a month ago, and there was a couple of trees around, and what happened? Started beating on the tree immediately, you know? So Weems really should be noted as one of the great literary, that book of his flew off the shelves. As Christopher Harris summed up on writing about Weems, that Weems' biography was all these. He had succeeded in producing a bestseller. So, which to me, Weems is the one that's really. And we've gone through 140 years condemning Weems and making up lies. It's about time we set the story straight with some evidence. So, if you have any questions, we'll do. Thank you.
So, thanks. We will take some questions. I do want to say we discovered, with this new screen, for those of you out watching it on Facebook, you can't really see the slides, but there's a link in the comments that posts to a PDF of the slides that you can look at. And when we do the recording, we'll put them in at the end. So people can go back and listen. We're always learning something new with improvements, right, of technology here. So, questions? Yes.
With the cherry tree story, was it told by Weems in the first edition of his book?
No, it was the 6th edition.
That's right. So
The reason why I think happened, he did the first book, and it was a small pamphlet, and then it became pretty popular. So he knew he was going to be adding to a full-length book. It turned from about 45 pages to over 200 pages. So and I'm sure his father-in-law, Jesse Ewell, dies in 1805. So I'm sure when he was sick and when family members were visiting him, they said, we know you're going to add more anecdotes into the book. Make sure this anecdote from Aunt Simon gets in there. And he probably said, yeah, I'll make sure it does because she told me that anecdote 20 years ago at Mount Ayr. So I'm sure those stories started to reappear, some of those new anecdotes, because they knew he was going to add.
You sure you don't want a book?
Yeah.
Think about
I was taken by the middle name Locke Weems.
Locke,
Related
it's
to
his
John
mother's
Locke.
main name was Locke.
Yeah, related to John Locke from Scotland.
You know, I haven't
You didn't dig
researched
that
that
far?
bad, but they came over here spelling the name L-O-C-H. But it, you know, the way that things get transferred, it certainly could be the same family. The Locke family was very wealthy in Scotland, so I don't doubt that there's
Yeah.
possible.
And influential in our thinking about
Right.
founding the
The
country. Yeah.
Enlightenment is all about that.
Yeah. So how many people believe the story now? It's the conference. Yeah. Other questions?
it. Thank you very much.
thank you.
Thank you very
Well,
much.
Jim will be out signing books if anybody didn't get a copy or get theirs signed yet. If you'd like to talk to him further, he will be at the Lancaster, Virginia Historical Society Museum in Lancaster Courthouse tomorrow morning from 10 to 11. If you think of some things overnight and you have more questions, or you read the book, stay up late reading it and
Yeah,
have
believe
questions.
me, this book is it's just got so much history in it.
Yeah.
There's so much information in there that I couldn't even touch upon today. But it's a real deep dig into family connections and all of this George Washington related. It really is. There's so much new information about George Washington in there, about his life and the Ball family.
That's one question. Why do you think no one else has looked at it in this way?
It's too hard.
Yeah.
Historians take these, I mean, just to take the Ball family, the only Ball member that Mary had was her brother Joseph. The other ones all married into different surnames. And historians don't like genealogy. So they have a hard time keeping those different, and so they just don't even try. And I think that they just don't try. Washington's easy. If you look at it, and I start out the book, if you look at any of the indexes, you can look at Mary Ball's sister's husband's name. None of them show up in an index, but you look at Washington, there's 80 different Washingtons in those. You know, but so I just don't think they try.
Well, I like to think, that your model is something great, and it's something we try to do at the Historical Society. We don't have genealogy in our formal name, but it's definitely a piece of what we do, and it's in our name of our library services, and bringing, artifacts and written history and oral history and genealogy and archaeology all together. We learn so much more from that interdisciplinary focus.
I've talked to Melanie many times about this, but you have to incorporate everything in archaeology, genealogy, because only through doing all that can you incorporate and really understand the history better.
And if you do want to know a little bit more archaeology, that's our current exhibit right now. One of the rooms is a case study of archaeology from Millenbeck, which was the William Ball 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 family. So it gives us a little insight from those fragments of what life was like there in the early 1700s and 1800s. So.
And I heard a couple of people earlier talking about the Civil War. If you follow the Civil War or the Ball family up, you'll notice that James Ball and George's family, they ended up marrying into the Carter family, and there's where Ball's Fort, at the Battle of Bull Run, First Manassas, that's Ball's Fort. They come right back to here. And also, Burgess Ball's land is Ball's Bluffs up by Leesburg. That's where he ended up landing. And so those are the two balls that have Civil War connections that come right back here.
Well, thank you, Jim, very much.